With the state budget due in less than 2 weeks, we're checking in with the Senate's Deputy Majority Leader, Mike Gianaris, a Queens Democrat, to discuss the Senate's priorities during negotiations with Governor Kathy Hochul and the Assembly Democrats. Welcome back to the show, Senator.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
So right now, what's the narrative around the Senate's budget priorities? Is there any sort of grand unifying theme?
Yeah, I would say we're fulfilling promises that have been unfulfilled over the last decade. We have been under very tight restrictions on our budget the last decade, mostly because the previous governor insisted on spending caps that were unnecessary. And as a result, a lot of important services that should have been getting attention have been neglected. So what do I mean by that? Well, we're looking at higher education, CUNY and SUNY. We're looking at continuing our K-12 fulfillment of the CFE promises. Healthcare is something we're trying to extend to more New Yorkers. These are the kinds of things that should have been done in the past and weren't. And by the way, we're proposing all these things without the need to even raise taxes. We did have the millionaires tax increase last year, which is part of the reason we're in such a good position financially. And this is a perfect time as we're trying to come back from COVID to give people the kinds of support they need to do that. I didn't even mention the banner proposal, which is universal child care, at a time when we're asking people to get back to work, get back to their offices. They have been working from home, which gave them some more flexibility in dealing with their children. Child care is going to be a necessity to give people the ability to get back to work. And so all of these things happening at a time when we have the money to do it is the right thing to do, and hopefully in the next 2 weeks we'll all come to terms with that.
You mentioned the fact that this budget does not create any new taxes or raise any existing taxes, something Governor Kathy Hochul focused on when she unveiled her version of the budget. This is made possible for at least this year due to federal funds as well as revenues coming in higher than projected in the current fiscal year. But when you think about the future, do you think that the level of suspending that we've kindly set as a new benchmark with the one house budgets and the governor's budget is sustainable for years out, or is there going to have to be some sort of injection of new revenue in the form of higher taxes?
Well, we increased taxes on millionaires last year, and that's part of the reason why. It's not just revenues coming in higher than expected in federal aid. It's also that we did raise taxes on the wealthy last year to give us this ability to do this. And by the way, all of the hysteria from the wealthy that we're going to doom the economy proved untrue. The economy's bouncing back, and we've now generated additional revenue to allow us to provide the services, which, by the way, are connected to our economic success. I mentioned child care. If we don't have a strong universal child care system, people will not be getting back to work the way we need them to, as hopefully the pandemic comes to an end and turns more into an endemic. If we don't provide for a good public education, both K-12 and higher ed, people won't have the tools necessary to succeed in the economy, which will ultimately generate more revenue for the state. So it's a false choice to think that we either have to provide services or have a strong economy. We have a strong economy when we provide good services in this state, and that's very sustainable if we do it right.
So it sounds like you think that these initial investments, which are made in part, like you're saying, with higher taxes that were included in last year's budget on millionaires, but as well as some federal money, you feel like these will eventually, just sort of pay for themselves and create benefits that will make these sustainable in the long run?
Well, look, we know we're solvent for the next couple of years, and this is a constant evaluation we do every budget season. And when we need to raise revenues, we should not be afraid to do that. By the way, during the pandemic, while a lot of people were suffering, there were some industries that were wildly successful. And we should not be afraid to say to those people, you should chip in more to make sure that the rest of the state is successful. And so that's an evaluation we do every year as we go through the budget process. We know we have enough funds to carry us through the next 2, 3, 4 years at this point. And as we adjust our approach over the years to come, that's something we should certainly not be afraid to look at.
You mentioned the investment in childcare that the Senate Democrats as well as the Assembly Democrats prioritized in their one-house budgets. You talked about higher education, something where lawmakers look like they're willing to invest more than the governor. Home care is another issue where the lawmakers have increased the spending above and beyond what the governor initially proposed. If I can get you to negotiate in public a little bit, has anything emerged as a top priority for you and the Senate Democrats that might not necessarily have been in the governor's budget?
I'm glad you already gave my answer by asking me to negotiate in public, which is something that we wouldn't do. But I will say this: we have been pretty clear that some of the big ticket items that we value greatly in our proposal are the universal child care, the New Deal for CUNY and SUNY, the extension of health care to those that don't have it currently, and continuing to fund K-12 in a way that we started to do last year. Those are important priorities, not just important for the legislature, but important for the residents of the state.
For listeners just joining us, you're listening to the Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with Senate Deputy Majority Leader Mike Gianaris about the state budget. The Senate Democrats opted not to prioritize another investment in the Excluded Workers Fund, which distributed about $2 billion last year, mostly to undocumented New Yorkers, before running out of money. How come there were no additional funds for the eligible New Yorkers shut out in 2021?
Well, we do have some limitations on our ability to spend, and so we had a lot of priorities. What we did do was propose extending health care for the undocumented population, and so there would be hundreds of millions of dollars in benefit in that form. Also, the services we're providing more broadly to New Yorkers also accrue to that community, whether it's the child care or SUNY and CUNY funding, or even just the public education funding. These are things that inure to the benefit of the undocumented as well as New Yorkers more broadly. We also have additional funding for housing assistance, making sure that we provide protections for those that have fallen behind on their rent payments during the pandemic, a program that was very successful and ran out of money last year as well. And so we have a host of proposals that will benefit that community, in some cases specifically, like the situation of health care, and in some cases to the extent that they're benefiting all New Yorkers, that population is included. And so in making these choices, we thought that we were doing as best we can to provide assistance in various forms.
Because the governor didn't prioritize the Excluded Workers Fund and the Senate and Assembly both left it out of their one-house budgets, do you see that as an issue that's basically off the table for the final couple weeks of budget negotiations?
Well, generally speaking, the parameters of a final budget agreement are set by the two one-house proposals and the governor's proposal. So in my experience, it's hard to get something big like that added at the last minute that hasn't been proposed by any particular side. So I would think that it's a discussion to be had going forward into the future.
It was reported last week, first by the New York Post, that Governor Kathy Hochul would like to see some changes to the state's criminal justice laws, including pretrial detention, something she's looking to get done potentially in the state budget. Have Senate Democrats been briefed on the governor's wish list?
We have been given their backup material. I don't know that there's been any specific meetings about it, but they have presented us with the points that they've released publicly and given us their backup memos, I suppose.
Could you envision Senate Democrats adopting any of the proposals that the governor is pushing for, at least behind the scenes in the state budget?
The governor threw the kitchen sink into this thing. It's more of a political document than anything else, in my view. Much of it is unrealistic to the extent there are things in there that make sense. We're always open to having reasonable conversations. And I know our leader, Leader Stewart-Cousins, has made that clear. 2 of the 10 points, for example, include additional funding for pretrial services, additional funding for mental health services. Those are certainly things we can get behind, I would think. Some of the other things that would take us backwards from where we were pre-reform, I would think are off the table. We're certainly not looking to take a circumstance that we had in 2019 that needed fixing and make it even worse. And that's what some of these proposals do. And to the extent there are things in between that and where we are today, I would think we'd be discussing them in the next 2 weeks.
And with regards to those proposals that she's advancing that would seem to roll back some of the changes in 2019, we're hearing from progressive lawmakers that if those are part of a final budget, they won't vote for that budget. Do you have a litmus test like that?
As a member of leadership, I'm always careful not to commit myself 2 weeks early before we've negotiated anything. But look, I think a hard line for me is we are certainly not going to consider anything that would move us backwards from where we started in 2019. Many of the reforms, even by our strongest critics, many of the reforms are seen as necessary and positive. So, look, more funding for services, I think we can all agree that's something we need to do. Going back to established standards that were more carceral than when we started, I think are not up for consideration to the extent there's tweaks in between where things are being suggested are not working as effectively as they could. I think that's where the conversation will revolve over the next couple of weeks, and we'll see where that goes.
And finally, as we head down the home stretch, do you feel like the legislature is in a stronger bargaining position in 2022 than it was, say, in 2021 or in past years when Andrew Cuomo was the governor?
Well, I think it's relative to our numbers and our strength. The last couple of years of the Cuomo administration, the legislature largely drove the process. And so, he was a figure that presented as a domineering bully, and so people gave him more credit at the end than I think he deserved. But all of that was because we achieved dual supermajorities. That is what legislative power revolves around, and to the extent we had that in the last couple of years, that is what has given us the ability to move policy. I don't think that's changed. That's the same power we had in last year's budget, for example. What we have now is a more collaborative partner so far in Governor Hochul. Low bar, of course, because fewer people in politics that were less collaborative than Andrew Cuomo, but she has been very forthcoming with her ideas, very solicitous of our opinions, and the next 2 weeks we'll find out if that's genuine or just a posture.
Well, we've been speaking with Senate Deputy Majority Leader Mike Gianaris. Senator, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave.